All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy.
Okay.
So he's a sociologist, social philosopher, and his work, especially his idea of like speech thinking, really brings up some pretty interesting challenges to like basic philosophical assumptions.
Hmm.
And I think for someone like you who is always thinking about the nature of reality, nature of knowledge, this idea that speech isn't just like a passive reflection of the world, but actually an active force that shapes our social existence. That's something that we really got to get into.
Yeah. And this idea of language being like the foundation, not just a tool, that's what's so radical about him, I think.
Exactly. And he wasn't like alone in this thinking, right?
Yeah.
Like he was connected to this really fascinating group of post-Nietzschean religious thinkers.
Yeah.
Like Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, who also believed that religious language could reveal like dimensions of experience that maybe traditional philosophical methods miss.
Yeah, it's this sort of suggestion that these thinkers had, that certain aspects of being human, right?
Right.
Especially those that have to do with belief and community, find their sort of their clearest expression in religious speech, right?
Absolutely.
That's I think like in connection to the broader history of philosophical inquiry. It forces us to sort of consider the limitations of these purely abstract or metaphysical approaches, right?
Yes, totally. And I think, the mission of our deep dive today is really to get to grips with Rosenstock-Huessy's critique of philosophy.
Yeah.
He felt that it missed things, by not giving enough weight to language and time and history.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for you, with your interest in philosophy, this is a pretty unique lens,
Yeah.
to look at some of the oversights maybe of traditional philosophical approaches.
Yeah.
So we're going to unpack his central arguments and understand why he believed focusing on speech, time, and history is so important, especially for someone like you who's thinking a lot about philosophy.
Okay.
Okay, so let's dive in. So one of the things that's really striking about Rosenstock-Huessy is like this assertion, right?
Uh-huh.
This very strong assertion that language is like fundamental.
Yeah.
Like that it's even more like primary than philosophy or religion.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, not religion but language forces man to distinguish between this world and the real world. The crux of theology is a crux of language, and all our rationalists are not protesting against religion, but against speech.
So, I mean, for a philosopher, I guess what this means is like the very tool that you use to think about these big questions is not neutral.
Right. And it's this idea, right? Like for a philosopher who's accustomed to viewing language as a necessary but also potentially like misleading instrument,
Yeah.
right?
For accessing truth, this idea that it's primary is really interesting, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he saw philosophy and theology as like second order activities, almost like echoes,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that follow behind the primary creative acts, arising from life's necessities.
Yeah.
And he had some pretty pointed criticisms of both.
Yeah.
Yeah. He thought that theology tends to like categorize us as either sinners or angels,
Mm-hmm.
like pretty simplistically, and doesn't really take our embodied existence like fully seriously.
Yeah.
And with philosophy, he thought that it often reduces us to objects, like mere objects
Right.
in this static universe.
Uh-huh.
And that we're just kind of like subjectively reflecting an objective reality, but missing the time endowing forces, which is a really interesting way to phrase that, I think.
Yeah, and what he's basically arguing is that these intellectual frameworks that have become so central to how we understand ourselves, they can inadvertently distance us, right? Like from this lived temporal reality that language is so bound up in, right?
Yes.
And so the question for a philosopher, I think, becomes, has this pursuit of timeless truths, right?
Right.
Led to a potential neglect, right, of this temporal and linguistic foundation of human experience.
Yes. Yeah. And that's exactly like what he wanted to correct, I think. Like his aim was to restore our awareness to the power that's in our speech
Mm-hmm.
and in our institutions.
Right.
connect us to the past and orient us towards the future.
Mm.
And he felt the philosophy was kind of weak at this task.
Yeah.
So he was drawn to sociology as, the way to win again our freedom over spaces and through times, he said. And, I think it's a very practical, dimension,
Yeah, definitely.
It's not just up here
Right.
in the clouds.
Yeah, it's not just this abstract contemplation,
Yeah.
right? It's about considering how do our institutions, how does our language shape our very possibilities, right?
Yes.
Shape how we even understand reality.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting here is that he replaces Descartes' cogito, right?
Yeah.
The I think therefore I am.
Yeah.
He replaces that with respondeo et si mutabo.
Yeah. I respond, although I will be changed.
That's so key.
Yeah.
So key. Can you unpack that a little bit for people who are thinking about, the very, very foundations of self and knowledge? Yeah, yeah. And so what's interesting here, right, is that where Descartes is prioritizing individual sort of rational self-certainty as this bedrock, right, of existence, Rosenstock-Huessy's I respond, although I will be changed, foregrounds our responsiveness, right?
Yeah.
To the world around us, to the past, to the present, to the future, right?
Yeah.
We are beings in relation.
Yes.
Right. And those interactions, which are always mediated through language, are really what mold our creations and mold us, right?
Yeah.
And he drew a lot from Vico, right?
Yeah.
This idea that we are bound to our history, right? Regardless of how hard we try to break free, to start over.
Yeah.
And it emphasizes this dynamic, this relational nature of human existence, right? As opposed to the isolated, to the self-sufficient thinking subject.
Right. So it's less about the individual consciousness, right, and more about the interconnectedness of experience, human experience. Yeah. Yeah. And as we said before, he really saw philosophy as kind of having a deficiency when it comes to time, speech, and history.
Yeah.
So what are the reasons behind that?
Well, a central reason for him was the nature of logic itself, right?
Okay.
He famously said, logic is that mode of spiritual life in which the divinity of timing is omitted.
Right.
So logic, in its pursuit of stable and universal truths, essentially extracts us, right, from the flow of time, right, into this sort of fixed but ultimately abstract space.
Right.
And he saw this preference, right, for stable space over time, reflected in a number of philosophical concepts.
Okay. Like what?
Well, I mean, you can think about the subject-object division, right? This clear spatial separation between knower and known, right?
Right.
But he went deeper than that. He even went to the very sort of roots of philosophical terminology.
Okay.
So topics as a field of inquiry, right, comes from the Greek topos, meaning place. Categories, the fundamental groupings that we use to understand the world, originally referred to declaiming in the agora a specific public space.
Right.
And even reason's sphericality, right? This idea of reason as spherical suggests this kind of contained space, right?
Right.
And even ideas, right? From the Greek idein, meaning to see.
Right.
So all of these sort of point to this underlying commitment, right?
Right.
In philosophy to space, to stable space, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to the ceaselessness of time.
Yeah, so it's almost like philosophy is trying to capture something that's fluid, right? In a static framework.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he extended this critique with his concept of the cross of reality, right? Which is this idea that anything that manifests in space and time, it's not a duality, but it's fundamentally quadrilateral.
Quadrilateral, okay.
Right. And so we experience reality through this interplay of inner uterness, right? Okay. The subjective and objective, right? Right. And what he calls trajective projectiveness, which is how we orient ourselves to the future based on our past, right? Right. so the trajective has to do with our actions and intentions, right? Directed towards what's coming.
Right.
And the projective has to do with the weight of our history,
Right.
our traditions, our memories, shaping how we perceive the world.
Right.
And this was his sort of alternative to the kind of binary or even triadic models of thinking,
Right.
that emphasize the multi-layered and dynamic nature of lived experience for beings embedded in time.
Right. Right. So he was definitely critical of philosophy, but was he like trying to dismantle it or?
Not at all.
Okay.
And I think this is what's interesting for a philosopher, right?
Oh.
Is that while he was critiquing, philosophy's tendency to undervalue language, time, and history, he himself can be seen as a social philosopher.
Okay.
Right. Advocating for this fusion, right?
Yeah.
Of history, linguistics, anthropology, sociology, religion, right?
Yeah.
And even Franz Rosenzweig,
Right.
who was a philosopher in his own right, considered Rosenstock-Huessy to be a philosopher. So,
Okay.
it's a nuanced position.
Yeah. So he wasn't necessarily against it, but he was looking to like reorient it,
Yeah.
give it some new priorities, a broader scope.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And his background, he was a really his intellectual background was really diverse.
Yeah. I mean, just his fluency, right, in a number of languages.
All right.
Right, including Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Right.
Speaks to a mind that was very much concerned with these sort of foundational structures, right?
Yeah.
Of human communication and thought.
Right.
He came to understanding reality by always considering the sort of underlying human and even divine sort of imperatives that shaped societies, right?
Right.
He had a strong methodological principle of always returning to original sources when making historical arguments.
Yeah.
And even his early conviction regarding the Nicene Creed, it wasn't from angst or anything, but it was from this belief that it was manifestly obvious, right? So it's a very different mode of conviction,
Right.
than we might be used to.
Okay. Yeah. And his understanding of Christianity also had a very particular emphasis. So he didn't view it primarily as a religion focused on like a transcendent otherworldly realm,
Right.
like in the Platonic sense,
Right.
but more as being concerned with building the future in this world
Yeah.
through the concept of incarnation and overcoming social death.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
for him resurrection wasn't just about this individual afterlife,
Right.
but it was about revitalizing, right?
Yeah.
Historically spend forms of life in order to empower future generations.
Yeah.
And he saw examples of this, of incarnation throughout history, from figures like St. Francis to even modern thinkers like Freud and Marx.
Interesting.
Right. So he was really emphasizing its ongoing relevance.
Yeah.
And his epistemology, he drew a lot from Goethe's "What is fruitful, that alone is true," and also the biblical idea of "by their fruits you shall know them." So he's really stressing, right, that truth is not just a matter of intellectual contemplation, but it emerges from timely and effective action, right?
Right. So it's like that emphasis on fruitfulness.
Yeah.
It has to actually do something.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has to have consequences. It has to have like an impact.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And this brings us back to his idea about speech, right? And specifically what he termed authentic speech, I think.
Right.
Right. So he made a pretty sharp distinction between like authentic human speech and just animal communication.
Yeah.
And for Rosenstock-Huessy, this authentic speech was like the very foundation of constitutions and institutions.
Yeah.
It's like this act that bridges generations and establishes all the complex structures of human society.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he even said that it's through speech that we reorganize the universe.
Yeah.
Like through shared experience,
Yeah.
and establish this cosmic solidarity.
Yeah, and the solidarity, crucially, is historical.
Right.
Right. So language is how history is how history permeates and shapes human life.
Right. So it's not just about like the content of what we're saying, but the actual act, right,
Right.
of speaking and listening
Yeah.
within that shared like social historical context.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And he emphasized, right, that speech is not just about what we communicate, but fundamentally it's about who is speaking to whom, right? So this reciprocal act of address is paramount.
Yeah.
And he gave this really compelling example of how a false address, right, like a misdirected form of communication, can have this huge effect, right,
Right.
on an individual's entire day.
Right.
Um, and this is in contrast, right, to these linguistic models like Saussure, for instance, right,
Right.
that tend to sort of focus on language units, right,
Mhm.
as opposed to their social circulation and historical context.
Right.
And so for Rosenstock-Huessy, right, the truths that we attribute to the world, they're not just passively observed, but they're created and revealed over time, right, through this dynamic interplay of speech.
Right.
So speech becomes a form of revelation, right?
Mhm.
It leads to orientation, it leads to mutual development, right?
Yeah.
Between speakers and listeners.
Yeah.
And he uses this vivid analogy of letter writers, right? Who become sort of polarized in their character through this evolving nature of their correspondence.
Right. Right. So it's a very dynamic and transformative way
Yeah.
to look at the power of language. And he even like extends this idea, to connect it with the very structure of our being, like of our social order.
Yeah.
He said that we ourselves become structured by grammar.
Uh-huh.
He even said that most men are shards of broken grammar.
Right.
So, implying this deep connection between our ability to speak and our social integration.
Yeah, yeah.
And he even proposed this radical reevaluation of the social sciences
Yeah.
based on his understanding of language.
Right.
He called for a grammatical revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And he saw the existing framework as being kind of like the Ptolemaic model of astronomy. Like
Yeah.
it's outdated.
Right.
And he went on to say, he argued that professions, like lawyers, preachers, artists, scientists, they're not just like functional roles,
Right.
but they're really like grammatical necessities.
Uh-huh.
Each of them embodying a specific grammatical mode.
Right.
That accentuates a particular dimension of reality.
Right.
And a healthy society, from his perspective, depends on the balanced interplay of these grammatical potencies.
Right.
And he felt that philosophy risks like messing up this balance
Yeah.
by overemphasizing, its own mode of understanding.
Right.
So that's a really interesting way to look at the different roles in a society. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
Like not just as like necessities, practical necessities, but as grammatically essential.
Right.
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 Yeah. And he also had some pretty strong critiques about linguistics itself.
Yeah.
He felt that linguistics was kind of following philosophy's lead
Mm-hmm.
by prioritizing the mind over speech, right?
Right.
And treating speech as the secondary tool
Mm-hmm.
for expressing pre-existing thoughts.
Right.
And he strongly rejected what he called the abstract madness of the school grammar that mistakenly takes the declarative sentence as the beginning.
Yeah. So he really thought that the imperative, the conjunctive, the preterite, the
Yeah.
indicative, they all arise from these specific temporal and spatial contexts, right?
Right.
They reflect this fundamental sort of experiential grammar of life, right?
Uh-huh.
Kind of like the biblical sequence, right? Of let there be light, right?
Yes.
The imperative, right? Creating a future.
Right.
And then there was light, the preterite, right? Establishing this past fact.
Right. So he really saw philosophy as having like instrumentalized speech almost.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
it's just a tool for expressing your thoughts, but didn't recognize the the formative power of speech.
Right, right.
Right.
And this is directly related to his analysis of grammatical moods and their corresponding philosophical implications.
All right.
So for him, the indicative mood, is connected to the notion of being right and existence.
Right.
The subjunctive mood relates to concepts of freedom and idealism.
Uh-huh.
And he even uses Kant's distinction between theoretical, which operates in the indicative, right,
Right.
and practical reason, which operates in the subjunctive, right,
Yeah.
as a sort of prime example of how these really fundamental metaphysical distinctions can be traced back to this ordering of language.
Right. It's like our philosophical frameworks are built into the very structure of our language.
Yeah.
And he had a very particular take on names versus pronouns.
Yeah.
So he argued that philosophy's preference, right, this grammatical preference for pronominals like being over concrete names, actually leads it away from what he called aboriginal humanity,
Right.
which is our most fundamental way of relating to the world.
Yeah.
And he emphasized how our lives are really built on an accrual of names, right? Like our own name, the names of our loved ones,
Right.
the names of our communities,
Yeah.
and that these reflect our responses to the calls and imperatives of life, right?
Right.
So naming becomes this act of orientation in the world.
Yeah.
And he contrasted this with the abstract nature of pronouns, which lack this grounding,
Right.
this specificity in terms of location, origin, even these deeply felt human experiences, right?
Right.
Like faith, hope, and love.
Yeah.
And he said the human world does not consist of will and representation, but as love and introduction representation.
Right. Sure.
Which is such a powerful way to highlight the relational and concrete nature of naming.
Right. Right.
Like of being named.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember that he also connected this preference for names back to ancient Greek philosophy, right?
Yeah. So he very insightfully linked the emphasis on concrete names, right, to Heraclitus's philosophy of flux,
Right.
of becoming.
Right.
Right, and the preference for abstract pronouns he linked to Parmenides, right,
Yeah.
to the unchanging being.
Right.
And he even has this image, right,
Yeah.
of Heraclitus dismissing the philosophical concept of being as merely the scalp of divine acts and political names, right? So
Yeah.
it's the suggestion that
Yeah.
that being is superficial, right?
Right.
That it's an abstraction, that it misses the underlying dynamism.
Right.
And for Rosenstock-Huessy, this philosophical obsession, right, with to be, the verb to be, with being as a noun.
Yeah.
It's akin to clinging to this dead husk, right? Or the smoke of lived experience.
Wrong.
Right. He calls it a proverb that stands in for all the other verbs.
Right.
For all the other verbs that describe action and relation. And he even points out, right, that children learn and use pronouns.
Right.
Right, before philosophers overemphasize being. So, there's a disconnect there.
Right. And he had a very specific critique of Heidegger on this point.
Yeah. So he offers this critique of Heidegger's, focus on being as a concept, right?
Right.
And he argues that the real choice isn't between being and beings,
Right.
but rather between the abstractness of pronominals and the concreteness of names.
Okay.
And he suggests, that Heidegger, despite his really powerful critique of traditional essentialism, he might have been inadvertently trapped, right, in these sort of ingrained philosophical habits, right?